I'm Matt Booker.
And I'm Dave Laird.
I'm Brandon Hobson, and this is the all-new Concavity Show.
Thank you, Brandon. Welcome everyone to episode 60 of Concavity Show. We're with Brandon Hobson, who is the author of the brand new novel, The Removed, which just came out in 2021. He's also the author of novels Where the Dead Sit Talking, which was a finalist for the 2018 National Book Award for Fiction and the winner of the Reading the West Book Award. Two other novels from Brandon are Desolation of Avenues Untold and Deep Ellum. Brandon's work has appeared in lots of places like The Believer, the Paris Review Daily, McSweeney's issue 61, Conjunctions Noon. He's appeared in the Pushcart Prize Anthology. And Brandon is the assistant professor of creative writing at the New Mexico State University and teaches in the MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Brandon is an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation tribe of Oklahoma. And Brandon, it is our great pleasure to have you on the show to talk about primarily your new novel, The Removed, which is brand new, which Matt and I absolutely loved, as well as some of your other work, and just dig in and talk about books and literature with you. So really excited to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
And
pleasure.
It's really special for me because I feel like I've known Brandon a very long time through the internet. And, there are a lot of people out there, maybe even people listening to this right now, who I have known in some capacity, but not had a chance to actually sit down and talk to.
Totally.
So to be able to sit down and talk is really special and awesome. And Brandon, I'm trying to think like when we first probably emailed, talking over 20 years ago.
It had to have been 2000 or 01. Maybe it was even the late 90s.
Maybe 99, maybe
99.
Yeah.
I remember you asked to see the letter that Wallace had written me, and then I faxed it.
That's right. That's how long ago we're talking about. Like the idea of scanning something in was we didn't even consider
didn't exist
that.
yet.
No.
Yeah.
But I used faxes all the time for work. And so you fax it to my work number. And I still have that copy, in a folder somewhere here.
I think I was doing social work because I remember the office where I went in there and faxing that to you.
I already got questions for you. So people who don't know this story. So Brandon, I guess you had joined the Wallace list, right? You were on the Wallace list, and you said like, Brandon had written to Wallace in like 1993. This is before Infinite Jest was published. And of course, he wrote you back pretty decent sized letter, full page letter. You want to tell us what you said to him and what he said to you?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I had been reading him for a couple of years. I think I first discovered Wallace in 91 or 92. And I'll tell you what.
That's early.
It was, and it was pre-internet, and I used to go to a library in Oklahoma City and just walking up and down the aisles. And I remember finding both The Broom of the System and Girl with Curious Hair and looking at them and thinking, wow, these books, both of these sound fantastic. I'm going to check these out, and I read them, and that was really what did it for me back then. Then I later, not long after that, found a copy of Conjunctions, issue 17, which I have here, in a mall in Dallas. I was in Dallas with friends and happened to find this, and he had a story, Order and Flux, in Northampton. And I thought, this is the guy that I read. I read that story and just absolutely was blown away. Anyway, so he just very quickly just flew to the top of my radar in terms of like, this guy is amazing. And so in 93, I was just beginning a doing an MA in Oklahoma, and I used to write every now and then. I would write to most people didn't write back, right? But
Sure.
I wrote a few. I wrote to Charles Simic, the poet. He actually wrote me back. But I wrote to Wallace, and in that letter, from what I remember, I don't have it saved anywhere, but I just remember basically telling that story and saying, I found your books. I was working in B. Dalton bookstore at the time.
In the mall.
In the mall.
Right.
In the mall. And saying, this is my, other than the library, I'm working in a bookstore and just trying to start graduate school, and I have no idea. I love to write fiction, and your work that I've read so far has really, really inspired me in ways that are difficult for me to explain, and feeling very lost and sort of, and then he wrote back this just extraordinarily nice letter saying, basically, grad school is very hard. I wish people thought I was as talented and as you seem to think I am, right? It was, which just a statement like that, it just sort of just blew me away, that that really people don't think.
Yeah, it's either like false humility or something else. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then basically said, don't be in a big rush to try to publish stuff. Take your time with it. At 22, I think I was 22 at the time, and he said, I wish I had done that at 22. Is take the time to work on it, loving the work, and hating it, and making making it as true to yourself as you take time. The publishing stuff will come. Just stick with it, basically. And it was just a super encouraging, nice letter. And I've still got the original. I did share a copy with the Ransom Center.
Cool.
I didn't send them the original. I sent them a copy, right? I just couldn't part with the original.
I don't blame you.
Yeah, that's fair. I think a lot of the stuff in there is photocopied, right? Not originals.
No, most of it is originals.
Oh, is it?
But I will say that Wallace famously wrote everyone back, almost everyone that wrote him, but over time his responses got shorter. He wrote on a lot of postcards, or he loved this method of, you sent him a letter, a typed letter, he would handwrite response in the margins and then send it back. I've seen several like that. So you're one of the few, I think, who got like the full treatment. Because I mean, honestly, he wasn't famous at the time. He had been, he'd gotten some attention for his first book, but that was in 87. That he had gotten that attention, and he was living in Illinois. He hadn't finished Infinite Jest. He's still writing. So I think you wrote to him at a pretty interesting time in his life.
Yeah, for sure.
I remember though that I think he was living in Syracuse, because I remember
Syracuse.
The postage was from there.
The postage saying Syracuse, New York, and thinking, oh wow, I guess he lives, because my only access to him at all was just through Girl with Curious Hair, which said he's studying. I think the bio on that book says he's studying, working on another. At Harvard, right? So I just assumed he was, in Cambridge or something, and it was.
And what did you think? So when Infinite Jest came out, I mean, obviously you bought it right away, and then
of course, I remember, and I was working at an independent bookstore at that time, and we got him to come. He did come, and
cool.
But so I have several signed books from him, but the postcards, you probably noticed there were postcards came at the beginning that Little Brown was sending out, and I remember and their catalog, and that kind of famous picture of him in the bandana reading or whatever he's writing came in the catalog, and just it being the catalog copy saying that it was compared to the Glass family, right? Which I thought, that's interesting. But Salinger's Glass family, right? And when the book came, we actually got an AR. I don't have the galley, but a buddy of mine that worked with me at the time, is still in contact with him, has that galley. And
Wow.
I remember he was like, I was
cool
so
one to
excited.
have.
He was like, yeah, go ahead. And he was the buyer for the store. And he's like, yeah, you can take it and read it, and I was so excited. And then Wallace came to the store. We got him to, on his tour to, this is before also, I didn't know that we stopped by the hotel where he was staying and left me and two other guys from the store and said, hey, if you want to have a beer before or after the reading, contact us at the store and we'll be glad to, we were just wanting to hang out with him, not knowing he was
in recovery.
Yeah, in recovery. Yeah, of course. And again, that was, I don't remember being even on the internet at that time. I worked in the back and doing returns and receiving, and we used to listen to the radio, but I remember listening to NPR and Bookworm and Silverblatt having too.
Yeah, cool.
We listened to Bookworm all the time back there.
Sweet. I loved receiving. I worked in a CD store, record store in my early 20s, and when I finally got trained on receiving, I was just like, jackpot. Up in a room, just listening to music for like 6 hours in a row. Don't have to deal with customers. Seeing all the new stuff coming into the store, setting like a pile aside for myself that I'm going to spend my paycheck on.
Exactly. Yeah, it was like that with the books too. And we would just listen to music or whatever back there. It was so great.
That's awesome.
Well, I appreciate you telling us that story because, like I say, that's how you and I met a long time ago, and the internet was very primitive back in those days in the late '90s. I think Nick started Howling Fantods around 97, 98, and they had message boards on there, and I didn't know anyone else who had read the book when I read it, and so I was eager to find someone to talk to, and I was Google didn't exist, right? I was on Alta Vista and Ask Jeeves of like Infinite Jest plot and like
Excite or Yahoo search.
Right.
Yeah, I remember that.
Right. There was no Google, right? This is before that. So I was, it was hard to find someone else to talk to, but somehow I found the email list, and that changed my life. I mean, because I met people on there who just an extremely eclectic bunch who had a lot in common. And especially after I moved to New York, but and people like Brandon Hobson at the time. Brandon had not published a word.
No.
Brandon, so I like to brag. I'm like, I knew the guy way back then. Whenever, like you said, so you did an MA, not an MFA, or you did an
social
MFA
work?
later.
My MA was just in English. I didn't do an MFA. I didn't even know there was an MFA.
You just teach an MFA program. Gotcha.
Yeah. Well, I went on later and I got a PhD.
Oh yeah.
I went. In fact, not just in 2009. I went back.
Cool.
Mainly for the teaching, so I could teach because I wanted to teach college full time.
Yeah.
And at the time I thought, well, I mean, I've published some stuff. I don't know if that will help me. I at least just want to teach comp and maybe some literature classes or something. So I did the PhD at Oklahoma State because it was my oldest son was a baby at the time. So I quit my other job and started the PhD and we lived very, very poorly.
Yeah, I'm sort of in that phase too. My wife just did a PhD in the last 3 years, and we took our 1-year-old daughter to New Zealand. So it's like kind of like taking a few steps backwards for sure. Yeah.
But
I get that.
I just did an MA early on. Yeah.
So walk us through your kind of history. Become like as a burgeoning fiction writer. Who are some other of your big influences starting out? In addition to Wallace, like what's the genesis story there?
I think so early on when I was an undergraduate, when I got my bachelor's in English, I read I took the introduction to literature class, right? And really liked Raymond Carver's stories. I really liked Lori Moore at the time. Dennis Johnson.
Yep.
Of course. These are people that I was discovering as an undergraduate that I had not ever heard of before.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, that was probably right before, because I think I had just graduated or was graduating with my bachelor's when I discovered Wallace. But before that, no, it was mainly just in who I was reading in class, really Dostoevsky and Kafka and just all that.
This rings a lot of familiar bells for me too in my early 20s, doing an English minor. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, and then I of course studied more doing my MA and really enjoyed that.
Did you do a thesis component to your MA in English?
I did. It's terrible. I would never show anyone any of the stories out of that.
Like a short story collection, kind of.
It was a story collection. That. But it was part of it was I was trying to purposefully parody different writers' styles but it was it's awful. But at the time I thought, this is kind of experimental maybe stuff that I'm doing here by showing a wide range of what I different styles that I can, little did I know that it was all just really, really bad.
What was the kind of feedback that you got from supervisors and when you did your defense and stuff?
Well, I took a class with Stuart, a couple of classes, I think, with Stuart Onan, and still to this day I've become really close with him. He's a great friend of mine, and he was young at the time. He was 33 or 34 at the time, and he was a visiting writer at University of Central Oklahoma, where I was doing a master's. And I thought, this looks like some great fiction writing class, right? And he was great. I mean, really introduced me to a lot of people I had not, like Tim O'Brien, right, and people that I'd not read before. So he was so. I remember I wrote a story about a guy who's living in a dumpster, right? living in a dumpster, and waiting for someone to show up for like this, for a drug deal or something, and he was really, really encouraging. I mean, he loved that I was taking risks and writing about this really kind of gritty life, and so he was really encouraging early on, and I've always been thankful for that support.
So your mentors weren't telling you your work at the time was terrible. You just feel that way so many years later in hindsight.
There's another guy. Yeah. Well, no, there was a guy named Ed Allen I took a class with. Wrote a book called Mustang Sally, a novel. And then later on taught at South Dakota. And then he had a collection that won the Flannery O'Connor Award.
Oh, cool.
He published a few stories in the New Yorker. Well, he was a visiting professor there also, and he did not like my work at all. Yeah, he was. In fact, I think he's one of the one that I may have mentioned in my letter to Wallace when I said I took taking a creative writing class. I love to write, but I just feel like I don't know that I'm very good at it yet. And do you have any encouragement? Because I have a professor who's really, really on me about a lot. It was very humiliating. I remember a couple of those. I think we wrote 2 stories, and he just really ripped me apart, which was probably good, I guess, at the time.
Sure.
The stories were horrible, but
Formative Hard Knocks and all that.
Has Ed Allen ever been nominated for the National Book Award?
Maybe he helped, but maybe he.
Of course,
he may have formed something, right?
Of course, he was doing his job. He was doing his job, but
lit a fire. Yeah.
That brief mention of you being a social worker, though, I mean, opened my eyes, because I want to get into the book now, because the mom in the story is a social worker, and it's kind of a thread that goes through actually a couple of your books. Where the Dead Sit Talking also has a social worker. Yeah. And maybe even in Deep Ellum, I went back and read Deep Ellum in the past month, and I was like surprised to see some elements of your later work showed up in that book too, and especially the family component. So this is one family, a mother and a father who have two sons and a daughter. One of their sons, Ray, has been killed at a young age, I think 15 years old.
By a police officer.
Right. And then another child from the agency where she works, I think it's a Cherokee agency, right? Or is it a
Cherokee Nation?
Cherokee Nation. It's a foster child, kind of appears and in a way maybe fills that void. So this is where I want to get into some questions about the book for you, because I feel like some people out there who are listening have probably read Where the Dead Sit Talking. And, after you wrote that book, or what's the genesis? I assume you wrote this after that, like sequentially. What was it about the story that came to you and said, you have to do this next?
I was thinking, okay, so originally I wanted to write a trilogy of Cherokee themed books. This is going to be and my next novel will be along the same
third
lines.
one. Okay.
Oh, cool.
The third one, right? So it's come out of a trilogy, at least now, unless I get some kind of William T. Vollman status and feel like, oh no, it's going to be 7 books, right? This is a 7-book series. I don't know. I mean, but originally I was thinking, I want to write 3 and have this trilogy specifically focused on Native identity.
Yeah.
And
not necessarily like totally related characters or families, but just thematically, there's this
thematically,
totally.
Not any kind of relation. Thank you for pointing that out, because it's really just focused much on Native identity and specifically Cherokee identity in Oklahoma. And so the third book is I'm working on it, and
well, you've had great success with those so far. I mean, they're both excellent, and you got tons of accolades. But this one, being called The Removed, in a way deals with the Cherokee history of removal in a sort of explicit way that Where the Dead Sit Talking didn't. So I guess I want to talk to you a little bit about that title, The Removed, right? Because in a way you have a child here who has been removed from a family, and then another child who shows up that has been removed from his family and placed as part of a placement with a foster agency into another family. And then, what if that child gets removed from that placement? And I feel that there's a lot going on there with, just as a microcosm of removal, but underpinning all of this is a lot of Cherokee history, starting with the name of the family, which is the Echota family, right? And this is an important name in Cherokee history. Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah. So the Echota treaty, right? The Echota family is named after the Echota treaty. That before removal in Georgia becomes an important name, right, in this treaty. And I think for me, I wanted to point to specific part of it is let me say what I didn't want to do, which was to try to offer an explanation, right? An explanation or to teach something like, very in a textbook way, because I hear a lot of readers that say, I really want to learn about Native life and Native history, and I mean, then, there are plenty of books out there that will talk about the history. So I didn't want to, but I
a
did,
novel to be like didactic in that
right,
social studies kind of way or something.
Yeah, not didactic at all, but to have little sort of clues that well, maybe not clues, but references to historical moments.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah,
and you do this beautiful interweaving of that through the primary characters in your story.
Sala,
there's
too.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, Chala, who is named actually Chala is part of Chalagi, which is the word Cherokee in Cherokee language. So Chala, is actually sort of based on a real man named Chali, who
and I actually looked this up a little bit more and watched
by the government.
A video about him too. And I mean, his book, there was Sequoia, right, which is another prominent, though the person who figured out the syllabary and wrote down the language basically was Sequoia. And that was the main character in Where the Dead Sit Talking. So that's when you say like these hints and clues are there. There's also, so we've talked about Ray is the child who was killed by the police. It's this huge absence. And, I think for me, that was part of the feeling too, that, this native population is carrying around like some kind of absence, and there's something missing, a person missing from their lives and is dead. Right. And there's a lot in the book about the dead and the spirits, the spirit world. Where do people go? Do you want to talk to us a little bit about how Cherokees view, the role of the dead?
Well, I'm not so much a traditional Cherokee in terms of my beliefs, but I know that there are some beliefs in that there is a question of justice and where souls go temporarily until justice is resolved, and that becomes a place called the Darkening Land. And these stories, in the traditional stories of the Darkening Land, there's really no major description of it, right? It's just a place. It's just the Darkening Land where these people go, or where people go in general. And so I wanted in this novel to make it, on one hand, very different from this world, but in terms of, people are coughing dust and seeming very sort of ghost-like and sort of zombie-like, I guess. But on the other hand, it's not too different, because people are still making video games, and in fact they're making live shooting games, which is taking it that step. Like, it's a fine. I feel like there's a fine line between reality and fantasy with this book, that you don't have to, I hope that you don't have to see this as a spiritual book, but you can see it maybe as fantastical, right?
That section reminded me, Brandon, of, have you read Chronic City by Jonathan Lethem, who actually blurbs this book?
I have not read that one. So it's just like, there's a part in that book where the characters become obsessed with these things called chaldrons, which are kind of these things that you can buy on eBay or something, but they're kind of ethereal and not really physical objects, and it's really hard to wrap your head around what exactly is happening in this. But they become like so obsessed with them, and one of the characters, Richard Abnett, at one point says, I just want to fuck it. it's like laugh out loud funny moment. But like the video game sequence of Edgar's friend, who's like using him as a character to like record his body movements and stuff for this bizarre kind of reality video game that he's making.
almost
Yeah.
has a similar quality to that, where it's really hard to pin down exactly what's going on here, but like
I've got to read that book though, because it's been on
cool.
my list for a while, and
But
Yeah,
so
it's good. There's a lot of Wallace references in there as well.
it's
Okay.
it's not as good as this. So Edgar is
thanks.
No,
the
it's not.
son he's the son who's still alive, but he's been geographically removed from the family, and he's in New Mexico, and they're in Oklahoma, and he is trying to get, well, he's on a journey, I should say, and they want him to return for this bonfire, which is part of their holiday and part of their remembrance of Ray Ray.
Yeah.
But to me, this also mimicked the geographic removal of Cherokee tribe, right? And that geographically they were in one place, which was the southeastern United States, like you said, Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and were forcefully removed by force on the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. So you've got them going this way. Edgar's in actually the other way, which New Mexico is sort of known for its Indian reservations too, right? Like
Right.
Navajo reservation, massive. And he's moving from Albuquerque to go east, back eastward rather than this westward journey. So
Yeah.
I thought that was a nice kind of mirror image of that journey.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I was trying to do, and thinking about the whole thing is really thinking about displacement, removal and displacement, are such heavy themes in this trilogy that I want to do. Is really and to do it in what I hope are in ways that haven't been done before when we're talking about Native, at least in terms of fiction.
Yeah.
I'm trying to approach it from a wholly new way.
Well, and I'm curious too about the relationships between the teenagers and adults in your books, because I feel like many of these teen characters seem like they don't fit in with their peers, and they tend to gravitate towards these relationships with adults instead, or often. And I'm just curious if that's, something from your past or something that you see in other people who just don't fit in with their kind, even at a young age.
With part of what was great about 7 years working in social work was I was able to be around families almost every day, and very, very difficult families who I've in no way even come close to writing about. And I sort of touch on it a little bit, in terms of the way that there are some, I think, some combativeness among them, but or the issues, the drug and alcohol issues, but that during those 7 years of social work, 2 of those years I spent working entirely with youth who were locked up and in a detention center, and youth who were on probation for numerous things, right? And going through the court system and watching them until they go off to placement, either long term. And so,
your sympathy there is for these people who are making mistakes, rather than, it's a system in a way that dooms them, right?
Yeah.
And I think this, this comes up in Deep Ellum too. And I want to put a plug in here for that book. If people have not picked it up, I think it's a great book that needs more readers as well. It's your first book. It's a slim novel, and it is also about a family, about someone returning home to, kind of a wayward child returning home. But it's also one of my favorite kind of books, Brandon, which is kind of just like a dude roaming around and you're in his head and like not a lot happens. You know what I mean? Like I love that kind of a book.
Yeah.
Well,
Sequoia is great for that, and Where the Dead Sit Talking, right? Just learning about his obsessions with Rosemary and like this fixation that occurs for him and in the household where he's been placed as a foster child.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. And I think with those characters, I feel like I'm such a more of a character writer, I think, than certainly plot, and the way that I picture them, and I placed Deep Ellum in the Deep Ellum district in Dallas because of my fascination with that area and just really, really loving that area and thinking, why has nobody written a novel about this area? It's just
you
amazing.
wrote it. It's the great
great
Deep Ellum novel. You wrote it.
Well, but it's really interesting because a small press published that Calamari Archive, and then my next book as well. It was really, really difficult for me to get people to believe in that book early on. I could not get. They just thought it was too weird, and there are some very difficult moments in Deep Ellum that aren't really fleshed out but are hinted at. Some incest and some abuse, and so it's in some ways kind of a difficult subject matter, I think.
Yeah.
But that interest in the kind of mistakes that young people make, I think Edgar falls into that category of, he's made a lot of mistakes and disappointed people in his family, and yet there's still kind of this opportunity for redemption for him. And he's on this journey somewhere between where he's at and where he needs to end up. He ends up in the darkening land, but he's on this kind of redemption path. And when I was asking you earlier about like the dead or the spirit world, I think part of that is just a general interest that I have in like the idea of reincarnation, right? And in a way, this child who shows up, Wyatt, is almost like a reincarnation of Ray, right? The first son who has not been there. Edgar's not, right? Edgar's not Ray. Like, he is not the reincarnation.
Oh.
No.
He's the fuck up, right?
Right. And part of that rebirth, right? Ancestors, Edgar sees, he has a vision of his ancestors crawling, right, through the house in the middle of the night, and the way that the ancestors were crawling and dying on the trail, and that ancestral trauma, right, lingers, especially for. Well, I hope that in the book that it lingers for everyone.
Yeah.
But that the idea of seeing someone's spirit in someone else, not to sound, again, this is not to sound too new agey, but I think in what I can say traditionally through a Cherokee lens is that we can see when a spirit is manifesting itself in someone else or in nature, and certainly the land can remember trauma, or then the land can manifest itself in various ways, or nature, and that's a lot also to do with the bird imagery.
The fowl, the red fowl. I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, and the red fowl, I think the obvious is it's a metaphor for addiction on one hand, right? Because he gets the red fowl when he's given by his friends when it's a baby red fowl, and he starts using, and then eventually it follows him around, and he can't get rid of it. It's constantly, that kind of. I've talked about this before, but I like the word foul because it sounds a lot more cryptic than
chicken.
Yeah, yeah, chicken or blue jay or dove or cardinal that have a little bit more sort of poetic. Fowl sounds kind of like grackle. Grackle is kind of right.
Yeah, it's got a dark vibe to it.
Yeah, and so a lot of people have asked me about that because of how I purposefully used repetition. Foul, I used it several times early on, and really just to show that I was really using it as a metaphor for the addiction that has really crippled Edgar's life at this point in the story, and that he can't get rid of it. It's always there.
It's kind of like the spider bite metaphor that recurs in Infinite Jest.
Sure.
Spider bitten will.
Yeah.
Speaking of the repetition, reminds me, I wanted to ask you, like, on a craft level about putting this together, because each section is kind of from the first person point of view of that character. How did you approach that? Did you know right away that you wanted to just do this one character and then switch between 5 or 6, or was it, what was your thinking there?
I originally had Maria's sections in third person. I had the entire section, or at least most, maybe not the entire, all of her sections, but I had most of them in third person. But I had I had Edgar's in first, Chala's in first, and Sonia's in first. But I had Maria's in third. And my editor at Echo really challenged me about rethinking that, in that it felt unbalanced and almost that it was too distant. It was too distant of a third person. And my fear was that, can I get inside the head of this older woman who's really lost a son? I was a little afraid of doing that. Right?
I think it was a good choice to do that, because I personally found Maria to be like the most endearing character in this novel. Like, I just really, she has such a beautiful softness to her, and she's carrying, all this trauma, and that's familial, and it's, a result of systemic racism and all this stuff. Like,
I actually spoke to a friend of my mother's who had lost a teenage son, and to really try to get that voice and some of those details. So that was, that's, I've heard a lot of people say that it's interesting because Maria's voice, they say that certainly is the most endearing out of all. I really like Edgar's sections.
I do too.
The most, and most people don't. They like at least that I've talked to. They're like, it was just too icky and too strange. And
Maria's has like a real tenderness to it. Edgar's has a tenderness as well, but it's like more of an edge to it, because he's like in the shit. He's like really, really going through addiction stuff. He's displaced from his girlfriend, and he's like really wrestling with his home, like to return to his home or not, to commemorate this traumatic event in his family. And it's like, seems really clear that he's been, his person has been so informed by the loss of his older brother when he was really young, right? Like Ray Ray kind of haunts his existence in some ways.
It does. And he even calls Desiree Ray, his girlfriend, that and it's supposed to haunt him. I think and that like, I say this a lot, but Chekhov says fiction should explore questions and not necessarily answer them, right? So often we come to fiction looking for answers, or so many readers do, but it's just,
or at least Richard Dawkins does, based on his Twitter post this week about the metamorphosis.
I saw that. Yeah, that's funny. But that's part of the question of how do people grieve?
Yeah, totally.
Well, and these are not, I should say these are in a way regular people, right? Like, you're not writing about people who are creative writing professors. You're writing about people she's a social worker and your kid is, and I wanted to ask you about that as it relates to dialogue and writing dialogue, because I felt like a lot of the writing in this book was even more intentionally clipped sentences and a lot of really straightforward, vocabulary. Like, do you want to talk about that kind of style choices you made?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I tried to. I'm glad you mentioned vocabulary, because I really feel like, at least in some of the comments I've read about the book having very simple prose, or that these are not college professors, these are not medical doctors, these are not psychiatrists. The people that I'm writing about are just sort of everyday people, and kind of blue collar. I mean, Ernest is just kind of a retired blue collar man with, unfortunately, in the early stages of Alzheimer's. And Maria is a social worker. Sonia works at a library, is in between jobs, sort of, and doesn't drive but rides a bicycle, and just goes to the bars a lot at night. And so it's more of a blue collar sort of Oklahoma family, whether they're native, whether it's native or even if they were non-native. I wanted them to speak in very sort of ordinary language, and so that means not writing very long, flowery, very difficult sentences, and using which, by the way, I love reading, but what the book doesn't call for that in ways that certainly Deep Ellum and Where the Dead Sit Talking don't either. I hope that the third one will be a little bit more verbose, and
I really love the style of at least these last two books. The simplicity of it is really beautiful, and it kind of, like, in some moments I felt like, this feels to me the way I felt like when I was reading Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which is that the sentences are not, they're not big, they're relatively straightforward, but like there are these just very often punctuated by these wildly poignant moments through simplistic language, or not
we haven't talked much about Sonia. We haven't mentioned Sonia at all in her story. And I actually felt like there was a lot of passages in there that I had underlined where, it got you into her head in a way that, I think you did a great job of writing from that first person perspective from women characters. And
thanks.
Totally.
And really it didn't. And I think the highest, or the best way to say that is really just like, I didn't even think about who the gender of the writer is. I was just in the character.
Yeah, totally.
And there were also, vocabulary wise, a number of Cherokee words in here that I did underline and search. So I think, people, when they're starting out writing, tend to just try to cram everything into one book and put in all of this vocabulary language.
Yeah.
and I think it's actually really hard to, tell a story with some authentic characters. And in a way, this is probably, I feel like, maybe your most like plot-driven story. That's in a way, it's a very basic plot, but in a way, it is, every page is advancing that story.
Yeah, it feels like a real convergence happening, like watching Magnolia or something, where like you can feel the momentum of this story is moving towards a real sense of climax. In Where the Dead Sit Talking, I felt like I was much more like, where's this going to go? Where's this going to go?
Yeah. I think my editor really helped me make it much more propulsive in terms of moving it along. And honestly, it was a lot more sort of all over the place when I turned it into her. And so she's the one that sort of helped me with the timeline.
Yeah.
She said, really, doesn't this take place over a week? And I said, yeah, probably right around a week. And so she's like, for the reader, let's, give the reader a little bit more of a clearer timeline here with the dates. And so she was really able to help me sort of keep my hands on the steering wheel and keep it,
steering wheel that doesn't fly off while you're driving. Yeah.
Right.
Those are always good. Do you have a passage picked out, Brandon, that you'd want to read for us? We can give the listenership a specific flavor of what exactly we've been talking about for the last bit here.
Yeah. Well, I have several here that I have marked, but that I've been reading from when I've been doing readings.
Oh yeah.
Get the best one.
Unfortunately, all online virtual readings. I'm sure these days.
Yeah. I'm going to read from Chala's section.
Cool.
From toward the end. Beloved, regarding my death, I do not understand the reason why I awoke when I did. The soldier had taken my life and your life from us, from our family. We were no longer of this world. I saw only dark red, the color of blood. In death, as we slept beneath the earth with the worms and the cold mud and rocks, hearing the soulful howl of the coyotes and the drumming of our people, as we slept beneath the feet of those who stomped the ground and shook the heavens, I felt your mother's aching. I felt her suffering as if it were my own, a suffering so great I felt my spirit move restlessly in an unfathomable darkness. How long was I dead? Surely not long. I crawled out of the earth like a beast in the night, with necklaces made of bear claws and gold, with wet mud and worms matted to my hair, which hung to my chest. I crawled out of the grave and felt as strong and mighty as a horse, even though I knew I had died. I remembered the story of the tribe of root eaters and acorn eaters, whose wives were buried in the same grave as their husbands. And I feared I would look down into the grave and see my wife. In the old story of the root and acorn eaters, a lighted pine knot was placed in a wife's hand. A rope was tied around her body with a bundle of pine knots, and she was lowered into her husband's grave, where she would die after the last pine knot was burned. I feared I would find my wife's body in the grave, burned and dead, and the fear consumed me like a great fire. When I looked down, I was happy to see that the grave was empty. And here I stood, not of flesh, but of spirit, not of bone or skin as I had known. In this world around me, I saw a great fire right there in the same world where I had lived. A great fire spreading across the sky, heavy in flames, flashing and blinding. And I saw animals running to the trees and birds flying in the sky. Soon the birds changed into children and then disappeared into the flames. I saw columns of smoke leading to the heavens. I saw snakes with their heads chopped off. Their mouths were still biting. Their bodies slithered into the ground and turned into dust. The dust rose into more columns of smoke. I saw figures in that dust, figures whose faces I did not recognize, but whose bodies were strong, who rose up and drifted away as dust. They rose up and drifted as dust, falling into the great fire, and the sight was beyond anything I had ever dreamed. I saw the winged bodies of others forced into a vortex of wind and smoke, disappearing into the great fire, yet I was not afraid. I could see for miles. I saw boys from my childhood dragging their dead mother around so that corn would grow. They were wailing in fear. I called out to them, but they couldn't hear me. Most of our people were at stockades, waiting to be moved west. Our people were being forced out of our land. This I knew, but I could not understand why. My thoughts were cloudy and confused as they can be in sleep. I tried to remember my name, but I fell into a strange loss of thought. For what reason did I awake? Why did I see these visions in the night? I saw ox carts and soldiers with rifles. I heard the crying of children and saw our feeble elders being lifted into government wagons. I saw a flash of light across the sky. A pale mist swirled before me like a small tornado, holding the image of someone I recognized. You, beloved, a strange vision, unlike anything I had seen before. I wasn't able to speak or call your name, and in an instant you dissolved.
That's sure, yeah,
I love that,
that's
man.
wonderful.
Well,
I mean,
thanks.
Thank you so much.
Heartbreaking and apocalyptic in very moving ways.
Well, and earlier you had used this phrase, ancestral trauma, and I think that's very real. And I hope that more people, research what did happen to not just to the Cherokees, but to all the tribes. And to me, this is one of the great, original sins of the founding of this country, is along with slavery, is the way that the native populations were obliterated. And if you ever travel to other countries to go to, Mexico or Brazil or even Australia, they don't have these reservations where people were removed to, and their native populations were integrated better into society and not wholesale wiped out the way that ours were. And I think
there's been genocides, colonial genocides in lots of places, right? But some places have done a much better job of this than New Zealand comes to mind as somewhat better-ish than say Canada or the US. Just
particularly atrocious in the US, and I would say needlessly cruel. And
Canada's a pure horror show as well in this context. I teach social studies. I have in the past, and there's a great deal of Canadian history that we teach in our curriculum is Indigenous history and First Nations schools and
up there, and I have some students from First Nations at
cool.
IAIA in Santa Fe. And it's so sad, and it's so much. What I've learned over the years is that so much of that hasn't been even discussed in the classroom.
Oh, totally. Yeah. There is a hopeful, burgeoning new sense of at least in British Columbia, the Ministry of Education here in the last 2 years has put out a lot of new curriculum in all of our courses that is mandating Indigenous, First Nations content, worldview, ways of knowing and ways of learning. So there is a what I think is a really hopeful push towards more education, more understanding of the ways in which colonial history just completely ravaged the people who were here before Europeans arrived. So that makes me hopeful as an educator, getting to I get to be a part of teaching more of this stuff and bringing more Indigenous literature into an English classroom, for example. And
and it's no exaggeration to say, Brandon, the writing that you have done has probably brought as much attention to Cherokee causes as anyone in our lifetimes. And really, you should be proud of what you've done so far, and the readers that you have brought into these characters and really made it real, that it's not just something that happened in the past, but that it's still a trauma that is still ongoing. And these generations are playing out. Every day there's another person who dies that remembers a story no one else did. And I think you shedding light on this stuff, like you say, it's not history, this is literature. It's serving the story's doing something else, and in a way that has its own power. So.
I don't know if this made it down to you guys, but in the last about a week ago, there was a discovery in Kamloops, British Columbia, which is pretty close to where I grew up in Kelowna, where through infrared technology, a discovery was made under a previous residential school of 215 bodies of children that was in a completely unmarked grave on the school grounds. And our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, tweeted about how the residential school period was such a dark chapter in our history. And it's, the language that was used in the tweet was like, this was a bad thing that happened in the past, and you just got eviscerated because everyone was like, this is ongoing, man. Like this trauma is here and it's present, and it's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, it's I encourage my Native students to write their stories and to keep the dialogue moving and to challenge themselves as a Native, what is it that they want to say? What is it that they want to write about? And why do they want? I challenge them with those questions, right? To think about what has not been said yet that you can say. And I mean, it's so sad, and there's so much more that needs to be said. And also on one hand, it's becoming, I'm glad to see that more people are seeing the wide range of Native writers out there who are writing about their tribes and the stories, and because every tribe is different,
totally,
and has different stories and different traditions, and some things you can't write about, of course, like I have to do a ceremony or something, but there are there's a great middle grade, I can't think of the name of the HarperCollins is it's an imprint for HarperCollins, and I can't think of the name of it, but there's a
we'll link to it on the show notes of this episode. Send it to us later.
But there's a Navajo writer named Brian Young who's written got a brand new book out that is called Healer of the Water Monster. That's a middle grade, and that comes out of a traditional Navajo story. And these are stories that we haven't seen, especially for younger readers before. So it's encouraging that there's a lot more writers, a lot more literature that will continue to become available, so that people won't ask the question of, well, here's one Native writer. Who else should I read?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I'm pretty hopeful about that. Like when I think of the landscape of Canadian literature right now, which I tend actually not to read all that much of in general. I just tend to read American fiction for some reason. But like we've got writers in Canada like Tanya Tagaq, who's an Inuit writer from Nunavut, the like most northern territory in Canada. She does traditional throat singing as a performance art, and she's won a lot of awards in Canada for it. Richard Wagamese comes to mind as well. So there is like a really hopeful burgeoning sense of like Indigenous voices are being published and they're being listened to and heard on a level I think that's a lot more in the forefront than what I grew up with, as a kid going to high school in the late 90s. I just don't remember reading anything like that in
Dave,
classes.
Did you grow up in Canada? You're Canadian?
Yeah. Born in Vancouver, and most of my life was in Kelowna, BC, which is just a couple hours north of Washington State.
Yeah. Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Well, and there's a difference between, works that existed and like things that are taught and things that are encouraged and widely read. And I'm sure, like say, our whole lives, there's actually been great, things you could learn. But things that are like widely taught, that's the big discussion.
And like mandated by the public education. Yeah,
right,
exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Brandon, this has been awesome. If people want to follow you, read more, where should they get in touch? You're on social media. Do you want to put your handles out there?
Sure. Yeah. On Twitter, although I'm not on Twitter that much, honestly. Twitter gives me severe anxiety.
Yep, that's fair.
Yeah, it really does, and I'm on it less and less. And I do get on there because I like to. I know so many people share articles and stories, and it's become even a source, you know, for me to like, oh wow, this person has a new book coming out, great, now I can look it up, you know, or whatever. But it's my Twitter handle is at BW Hobson. The much more comforting, I think, outlet is Instagram for me, because it's just, you know, sharing an image is
I get that. That's my favorite.
If a little more low stakes. It's a little less anxiety producing, and actually can be like fun and pleasurable. Like I find, even, you know, hardcore Twitter user for a long time, I find myself tweeting less and less, and I found myself just getting more pissed off when I'm on there, and I'm like,
well, it's very depressing in a way that it's one of the reasons I was on Facebook for a long time, and I just couldn't handle it anymore. And you know, after the election in 2016, everything just, to me, became,
it got really dark there. Yeah,
everything got very, very dark, and it gives me too much anxiety, and I have enough anxiety just waking up in the morning, and so
totally.
You know, it's like and to put, you know, social media in front of me, it's almost nauseating, and so but I am on.
I did see recently on Instagram, Brandon, that I followed Deb Olin Unferth, who was recommended to us recently by Jessica Anthony, who was a guest a few shows ago. So I read Barn 8 and I thought it was phenomenal. I was like, this, and then I saw she posted like you and her a couple weeks ago or something, just hanging out. And I was like, oh man, all these things are lining up for me lately.
She came through Las Cruces a couple of times, last summer once, and then she came right around Christmas, or she had, I think it was right after Christmas, she came through here and we hung out. Yeah. And I've known her for a long time because we both published in Noon, the journal Noon.
Yeah.
And, but never actually, I met her at AWP, I think for the first time, only in 2015. It wasn't that long ago, but we've since really connected, and cool. She's an amazing writer. Her stories are so weird, and you know, and she's got such a great command of the sentence, I feel like. Just a powerful, she can just write a good, powerful, direct sentence, and I've always liked her stories. And so Barn 8 I haven't read yet, but I have it, and but her other books,
I hear Vacation's really great too.
Vacation's fantastic. Yeah. She's a really, really fascinating person to talk to.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, just her life, and she also teaches she's in Austin. She's Austin, right?
Yeah.
Teaches for the prison, and so very.
We'll try and get her on at some point soon.
Yeah,
hopefully.
she's. I think
talk to her.
She's really fascinating. Yeah,
that's cool. Are there any other contemporary writers with whom you either have friendships or you're really enamored with their work, and you're like, people need to check out and know about this writer?
Wow, there are so many. That I've developed, through a community of through AWP, and there's just so many. And then the people I teach with at IAIA, Pam Houston and Tommy Orange, Tony Jensen.
We've got the There Tommy Orange book in our house, and I'm hoping to get to it really soon. I think it's great.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
Cool.
And that book, I read his, or at least about 90 pages of his sequel, which will be coming out, I think, next year. And cool. It's good stuff. He's a really, really good writer. Actually, and the other thing I was going to mention too is I'm actually writing a children's book it's kind of a middle grade book. that I hope to finish by the end of the summer.
Wow.
Awesome.
And only because I've never written one, but Scholastic already bought it.
Wow, congrats. That's great.
Thanks. And so I thought, well, now I've got to write it, right? Because it's signed and I'm like, wow, I can't believe it. Okay, I'll try
Spent the money already.
Yeah.
It's like, oh shit.
Yeah. So otherwise I can't pay it back at this point, right? So, but no. So I'm going to UCross, the residency in Wyoming, the first 2 weeks in August, and I'm going to try to finish it up in those 2 weeks of solitude there.
Awesome.
And, but then it's back to the bigger novel, which I'm excited about, because I want it to be. I mean, again, it's part of this trilogy of Native identity, but I want it to be. What I hope is a little bit more experimental, I guess, structurally.
Yeah.
Not in terms of language or anything, but structurally. I don't know. We'll see.
Cool.
I
I'm
like,
looking very much forward
Push
to that.
the envelope. Put some weird shit in there, Brandon.
Yeah.
Just put some weird shit in there.
Yeah, we kind of like that stuff here on the show.
Well, but my book Desolation was actually my PhD dissertation.
Oh,
A
cool.
lot of weird shit in this book.
And that, it's structurally, it's everybody will tell me that, God, that book's all over the place. What was your structure? Or did you just throw a bunch of shit together? And and I did try to have a structure with that. And the problem is I would love to sometimes talk to you guys just only about digressions in fiction. Only
good topic.
And just have a topic of digressions in Infinite Jest, in Gravity's Rainbow, in The Lost Scrapbook, and how these digressions structurally add to the overall
experience.
Yeah, the overall experience of it, right? Because people think digression, you think distraction, but I think we can all agree. Yeah. No, this is part of it, right? The experience.
I just remember all of my favorite professors in university were the ones who they're talking about this subject they're supposed to be talking about, and then they just go on a half an hour tangent.
Right. Yeah.
But that was like, that's when I would really perk up and be like, okay, this is where the cool stuff is happening.
But I also think Wallace would say, that's what reality is. It's fractured. It's not all linear, right? And
Newburyport is a good
also
example of that.
Just in the middle of you writing something, you get an email and, now this email is in your brain and, someone walks in the room and says something to you. Is that a digression, or is that just part of the fabric of your life? And that's your experience. Right. Yeah. And it's like, if you're trying to portray a very linear plot, sure. Someone who just goes over here and like plays a baseball game for 20 pages, I mean, that doesn't add to the plot and that would distract someone. But if you're trying to show the fabric of someone's life, I think, I also think there's some movies that do this really well. And I really love the Richard Linklater movies, the Before Sunrise, Before Sunset, like Before Midnight, which are, Ethan Hawke, which are just like conversations. And like, in a way, the whole thing is a digression. Like there's not a whole lot of plot, right? Like they walk around, that's the plot. And it's like, I'll meet up here. Like I could describe the plot to you in like a page. But the whole thing is like two people falling in love, and how you illustrate that is through these kind of conversations that bond people together. And often, just like what would bond you and I is like, dude, let's talk about some music that's mentioned in the book now, or let's talk about this.
Elliott Smith,
and it's like, that has nothing to do with like, like how people create bonds are also people creating that bond with a book. And like, I create a bond with a book that does have, I would say, non-traditional stuff, right? That it's not just like an Agatha Christie novel where it's like, who done it? I don't know. Like, I need something to bond me to the book that is a little more, identify with the book.
The movie that does it the best is if you've seen My Dinner with Andre.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's what all these other movies want to be, is that
right? Is that movie? Yeah.
Wallace Shawn. I mean, for sure that set the standard of like what a talking movie can do. But I actually think I've just discovered in the past year this movie that I really, really love called La Maman et la Putain, which is The Mother and the Whore, a French movie by Jean Eustache that came out in 1973. And it's kind of the end of the French New Wave. And it's almost 4 hours long. It's 3.5 hours long. And it's literally this of like a dude sitting in a cafe. They go home. He's got a woman there. They have a conversation. It's just people having conversations for 4 hours.
There's a long section about this movie in Helen DeWitt's The Last Samurai that I just finished.
Wow. Well,
I was like, why does this sound really familiar?
Because I'm always talking about that. Well, there's a book that just came out about that. So I think even My Dinner with Andre is like deeply influenced by this other movie that's like just people in a cafe sitting and talking for like an hour and a half.
Yeah, can you send me whenever you?
I will happily.
The title of that, I would love to see that movie.
Yeah, it's you would. Everyone listening, go watch it. It's fantastic.
Yeah,
but it's that sort of same thing of like, what makes good art this way? Is it the digression itself, or is it the plot? Is it the characters? And it's like. It's people who are wired different. I mean, there's plenty of people who want to watch a movie that's just 90 minutes, give me a story and people happy ending and I'll be fine. Mm-hmm. And there's other people who are just, like you and I, I'm like, I'll actually sit and watch people talk in a cafe for like 3 hours.
Absolutely.
And it'd probably be just as compelled by that reality. And I think, so you said, we should have this conversation about digressions. And I'm like, man, that's actually kind of all I want to do right now. It's like, talk about
that's why
like
our
digressions.
Episodes are like over 2 hours
I'm like,
sometimes. Because...
you know what? Fuck it. That's reality for me. It's like my whole life is a digression from doing one thing to the next.
I totally agree with you because I feel like, and structure, we talk about, and I do this to students all the time. We talk about, they don't understand structure and they have this idea in their mind that they have to follow this linear timeline, right? And yes, in short stories, and I think especially if you're thinking about the typical New Yorker story or a story in Harper's or something, right, is going to sort of follow this timeline. And we teach that stuff and we talk about that stuff a lot, but let's challenge that and let's talk about something that doesn't do that, right, successfully. Right. And what is it that is working? What is it that's working here structurally in the story in terms of these digressions? And I mean, I think, I think all three of us are very interested in the fractured narrative and certainly in reading the fractured narrative and how that adds to the experience of the book.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, I think there's other books I could give as an example that do this very well. Savage Detectives, Bolaño is pretty much any Bolaño novel is a great example of this.
Yeah,
and there's plenty of like whole parts of the book that are just like, and now I'm just going to tell you about this guy and his story. And then you go back to the other characters later, or like in 2666, the part about the crimes where it's like he could do that in 10 pages or 70 pages or 80 pages. And it's like, it's repetitive. And yet that's what the heart of the book is getting you to experience that.
I was thinking a lot about Bolaño and 2666 when I was working on my dissertation, when I was writing Desolation. And there's another guy named Curtis White. I think was
we know
colleague of Wallace's, right? So his book Requiem, his novel. Have you ever read Requiem?
No, but I've read his new one. He's got a new book out. Actually reviewed it. Tell us what Requiem is about.
Oh, it follows structurally it's supposed to follow Mozart. I don't know much about, but Mozart's Requiem.
Okay.
But you talk about digressions. It's all over the place, and there's emails and it's fractured and it's a really fun book. And my part of what bothers me, I think right now, is that people are really worried about worried about trigger warnings. The more that I hear people talk about, and I have trigger warnings, but I don't know. With art, it feels, and with books, it feels very different to me. It feels like I don't know about trigger. People have become like, there's a dead dog in this, right? It's a trigger warning.
And I was like, I gotta say, I think some of that is being in an academic setting a lot. I remember I went to a reading one time where a guy was like, there's a word in this story. I just want, before I read, it's nipples. The word is nipples. And, I have nipples. I'm a man. Like, I just don't want to offend anyone. And I was like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
What is wrong with us?
Exactly.
And like, there's a big thing going on right now with like, Elin Hildenbrand, this like woman who wrote a story or novel, and the character makes kind of an offhand reference to Anne Frank, and there was a huge Twitter eruption, and she ended up pulling the line and getting them to change the book. And it's like, art should exist outside of the Twitter sphere. It should not be subject to the police showing up and saying, oh, you can't say this that way, or you can't talk about this with that. It's like, I'm not doing it. This is the character in the book. And
I mean,
you're free to not read it. Don't read it. Fine.
Right, exactly, and it's gone way overboard. I agree, and that's really, with students, they are constantly asking me. I don't know, the younger, each year it feels like it's just getting worse and worse, and my response is just getting more and more of like, fuck it.
Write whatever you want, man. Write whatever you want.
Yeah, write whatever you want.
I mean, if art's not confrontational, then like what is it doing?
But to me, it's not even confrontational. It's like truth. And a lot of writers will tell you that, they wrote a book and it wasn't very good, and it's because they were holding back. They were doing something that was not true to them. And they know, like, oh, I should have actually just told this story about my dad, but I didn't want to offend him. And it's like, well, then you wrote a shitty story. You could have told the truth.
Right.
And like, I think Wallace has a line that's like, nonfiction is about things that are real, but fiction's about the truth.
Things that are true.
And if you can get that in your writing, it's fucking liquid gold. And if you can't, it'll never flow for you. It'll never work for you, because you're not the purpose of your art. The heart's purpose of it is like, it's off. Like,
right. Well, and those are the people I don't want reading my work anyway. I mean, I want the people reading my work, who are want to, have the experience and hopefully appreciate and engage in what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
So,
well, you capture the messiness of life and the messiness of family and of pain and trauma. And we can't recommend enough to our audience. The Removed just came out on Echo Press, which is a subsidiary of HarperCollins, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yeah, HarperCollins.
Cool. I was just at the bookstore a few days ago with my family and saw it on like the hot new wall, and I was like, "Oh wow, awesome! This is cool."
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. So good to see that it's making waves and getting out there. So, Brandon, thank you so much for your time. Do you have any final thoughts? Anything we didn't cover that you wanted to riff about?
Oh man, I hope I can come back on at some point and
anytime.
And,
all right, we can make it happen.
Yeah. No, there's nothing. I mean, I could talk to you guys.
Cool. We'll put all your contact stuff in the show notes, and people can find you wherever fine books are sold. Brandon, thanks so much again. It's been a pleasure talking, man.
Thanks for having me.
Catch me now as I say, into darkness I thought to be extinct.
I also love that we said all this stuff about how we're like soft resetting the podcast. It's not that much about Wallace anymore, and then we just talk tons about Wallace. That's great. I think that's no problem at all. It's kind of a pump fake, I guess.
Yeah.
Psych.
Trust us.
Yeah.
At
No,
some
we're still
point,
on
we'll
the
talk
same
less
bullshit.
about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk
Yeah.
less about it.